All right, so today we're doing a deep dive, and it's into some pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, definitely some heavy stuff.
Oh, yeah. So we're going to be taking on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on Maimonides.
It's a big one.
Huge. Yeah, so much to unpack there.
Lots to think about.
Well, for anyone who's not super familiar with philosophy or maybe hasn't heard of Maimonides before, he's considered one of the, if not the most important Jewish philosopher of the medieval period.
Absolutely a giant in the field.
And what I find really interesting is that he wasn't just a philosopher.
Right, not at all.
He was also this towering figure in Jewish law.
Yeah, a real legal mind, too.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote the Mishnah Torah, which is this, like, massive 14-volume work on Jewish law. Like, talk about comprehensive.
It's incredible, the breadth of his knowledge.
Yeah, really impressive. But he also managed to write this, like, philosophical masterpiece, The Guide of the Perplexed, which delves into all these complex questions about faith and reason.
A real classic of philosophical literature.
Oh, for sure. And it's precisely that combination, you know, the legal scholar and the philosopher, that makes Maimonides so captivating. So we're going to try to get to the heart of his thought.
Yeah, it's going to be a journey.
Definitely a journey. So to really appreciate where he's coming from, we should talk about his background a bit.
Yeah, context is always key.
Absolutely. So Maimonides was born in Cordoba, Spain, which at the time was this, like, major center of learning and culture.
He was a real intellectual hub.
Oh, yeah. But then things changed pretty dramatically when the Almohads came in.
Yeah, that invasion really shook things up.
It led to, like, years of exile and wandering for Maimonides.
Really tumultuous time.
Oh, yeah. He eventually settled in Fustat, which is now Cairo.
And that move definitely had an impact on his thinking.
So our mission today is to kind of distill all of that down.
Extract the essence.
Exactly. We want to find the most thought-provoking, the most relevant ideas in Maimonides' work.
The ones that still resonate with us today?
Yeah, exactly. Whether you're a philosophy buff or just, like, curious about these big questions.
There's something in Maimonides for everyone.
So where should we begin with this guy?
Well, I think a good place to start is with his sort of foundational orientation.
All right, like the bedrock of his thought.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that really stands out is his view of truth.
Okay, what's so unique about his view of truth?
Well, you could call it unhistorical.
Unhistorical? What does that even mean?
He believed in this eternal validity of the Torah, like it transcended time and history.
So for him, it wasn't just a product of a specific time and place.
No, the truth it contained was timeless and universal.
Okay, I'm starting to see what you mean by unhistorical.
Yeah, and all the 613 commandments, he saw them as all pointing back to the first two.
Which are?
Believing in God and rejecting idolatry.
Ah, the cornerstones of monotheism.
Exactly. They were like the twin pillars on which everything else rested.
So for Maimonides, monotheism was central.
Absolutely fundamental.
But it's not just any kind of monotheism, right? He had very specific ideas about what that God was like.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just a generic one God. It was a very particular understanding of God.
So how did he conceive of God?
Well, he believed that God was timeless.
Timeless.
Yeah, unchanging and immaterial.
Completely beyond the physical.
Right. Absolutely unified and fundamentally unlike anything in creation.
Wow, so even saying God is powerful is kind of tricky because our idea of power comes from, you know, the physical world.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of problem he was grappling with.
He even went as far as to say that worshiping God with an inaccurate understanding is a form of idolatry.
It's like having a false description of God.
Even if you're following all the other commandments.
That's a pretty radical idea.
So how did Maimonides think we could even arrive at this accurate understanding of God?
Well, he had this fascinating idea about Adam.
Adam, the first human.
Yeah. He believed that before the expulsion from Eden, Adam possessed this perfect metaphysical knowledge.
Like he knew everything there was to know about God.
Exactly. But then this knowledge was lost.
During the time of Enosh.
Right. And it wasn't until Abraham came along that this true understanding of God was rediscovered.
Through reason.
Yeah. Maimonides saw Abraham as this, like, proto-philosopher.
Yeah.
Figuring things out through logic and observation.
That's interesting because the Bible doesn't exactly spell out Abraham developing philosophical proofs, does it?
No, but Maimonides saw it as this implicit, like, logical necessity.
Okay, so even from the very beginning, there was this emphasis on reason.
It wasn't just blind faith. There was a rational foundation to it all.
So what about those other 611 commandments? Where do they fit in?
Well, Maimonides saw them as establishing a societal structure.
A framework.
Yeah, that actually supports and reinforces this true understanding of God.
They weren't just random rules.
No, they were designed to guide people towards this fundamental truth.
It's almost like the laws were meant to create an environment where people could, like, cultivate philosophical insight.
That's a really insightful way to put it. Yeah, he even argued that Jewish tradition has always had this philosophical dimension.
And even in the Bible.
Yes, he drew these parallels between Masa Bereshit, the creation account, and Greek physics,
Oh, wow.
and between Masa Merkava, Ezekiel's vision of the chariot, and Greek metaphysics.
So he saw those stories as having this deeper philosophical layer.
Exactly. It's like they were presented as parables, but with the hidden meaning for those who were ready to delve deeper.
So we have this concept of a timeless, immaterial God, knowable through reason, and the Torah providing this framework for understanding.
That's a pretty good summary so far.
But Maimonides also had some, let's say, unconventional ideas about how to interpret religious texts.
Oh, yeah, he wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo.
And that brings us to his idea of demythologized religion.
This is where things get really interesting.
Okay, so what's he talking about here?
Well, Maimonides recognized that the Torah often uses anthropomorphic language when describing God.
Anthropomorphic, meaning it gives God human-like characteristics.
Exactly. And it often talks about tangible rewards, like, if you do this, you'll get that.
So he was aware that the Bible could be read in a very literal way.
Oh, yeah, but he didn't think that was the ultimate goal.
He didn't think we should take those descriptions literally.
No, not at all. He believed that the true purpose of religion is to go beyond those surface-level readings.
To look for the deeper meaning.
Exactly. For example, when the Bible talks about prophets seeing God.
Right.
Maimonides didn't think it was a literal seeing with your eyes.
So what was it?
He interpreted it as this intellectual apprehension, like suddenly grasping the solution to a complex problem.
Ah. So more of an understanding than a visual experience.
Precisely. And when the Bible says God is near,
It's not about physical proximity?
no, it's about intellectual accessibility.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
And God, speaking to the prophets, that wasn't a voice booming from the heavens.
It was more about them receiving divine inspiration.
Yeah, like gaining insight into God's will.
So the literal narrative is just the starting point.
It's the doorway to a deeper engagement with the text.
I like that. The doorway.
Maimonides even interpreted Jacob's dream, with the ladder and the angels.
Right.
He saw that as an allegory for the philosopher's journey towards understanding God.
So each step on the ladder represents a stage in that journey.
Exactly. You start in the physical realm, then ascend to the celestial spheres, and finally reach the divine.
It's like a spiritual and intellectual ascent.
Precisely. And his central argument was that any interpretation that attributes demonstrably false ideas to the Bible is just wrong.
Like saying God has a physical body.
Yeah, that kind of literalism just wouldn't fly for him.
He was really committed to aligning religious interpretation with reason.
Absolutely. He believed that as human knowledge progresses, our understanding of Scripture has to evolve too.
That's pretty forward thinking.
Oh yeah, he wasn't afraid to challenge traditional interpretations.
And he had this great parable to illustrate this point.
Parable of the palace.
Oh yeah, tell us about that one.
So in this parable, the palace represents theological understanding.
And the ruler in the inner precincts is God.
Right, and those who reach the ruler are the ones who've achieved certainty in their understanding of God.
Through rigorous study and contemplation.
Exactly. It's both an intellectual and spiritual achievement.
So it's not just about blind faith, it's about really grappling with these ideas.
Yeah, for Maimonides, true understanding required intellectual effort.
Okay, so we can't take the descriptions of God literally.
No, because they point to something beyond language.
So how do we even begin to understand God, according to Maimonides?
Well, this brings us to one of his most intriguing ideas, the via negativa.
The via negativa, that sounds mysterious.
It is, and it's a key part of how he approaches God.
So what is it all about?
It's the idea that we can only truly describe God by saying what God is not.
Not what God is. That's interesting. Why is that?
Well, he believed that when we attribute positive qualities to God, like saying God is all-knowing or all-powerful or all-good.
Those are all good things, right?
Yes, but for Maimonides, it introduces a kind of multiplicity into God's absolute unity.
Like we're dividing God up into different attributes.
Exactly, and it inevitably leads to comparisons between God and created beings.
So if we say God is powerful, we're comparing God's power to our limited human understanding of power.
Yeah, and that's just not possible, because God's power is infinitely beyond anything we can comprehend.
So even saying God is good is problematic because our idea of goodness is based on our human experience.
Right. Maimonides argued that statements like God is powerful should really be understood as God is not lacking in power.
That's a subtle but important distinction.
It's about avoiding any kind of comparison or limitation.
But even negative descriptions, like saying God is not this or not that, still introduce a level of complexity.
Yeah, he recognized that language itself is ultimately inadequate when it comes to God.
So what's the point of even talking about God if we can't really describe God?
Well, for Maimonides, theological discourse serves a crucial guiding function.
It's about pointing us in the right direction.
Exactly. It's about systematically eliminating incorrect conceptions.
By saying what God is not, we get closer to understanding what God is.
It's a process of refinement, of progressively recognizing that God transcends our limited categories.
He even quoted Psalm 65, which says, "Silence is praise to you."
Yeah, that really captures the idea that language ultimately fails when it comes to God.
It's like the ultimate understanding of God leads to a profound silence.
A silence filled with awe and wonder.
But how does that reconcile with the everyday practice of religion, with things like prayer?
Well, Maimonides knew that a religion based solely on silent contemplation wouldn't work for most people.
It's not very practical.
Right, so he explained that the qualities we attribute to God in prayer are either negations, like saying God is not limited, or descriptions of God's actions in the world.
So we're talking about God's effects, not God's essence.
Exactly, he called these attributes of action.
So it's like when we say God is merciful, we're describing how God acts in the world.
Not what God is in God's innermost being.
We're seeing the backside of God, so to speak.
The effects, the manifestations, but not the divine face.
The essence remains hidden.
This via negativa really highlights the limits of human intellect when it comes to God.
It's a call for intellectual humility.
Absolutely, we can't pretend to grasp the fullness of God.
Now let's move on to another big question. Creation.
Ah, the origin of the universe.
What did Maimonides have to say about that?
Well, he considered four main viewpoints.
Wait a minute.
First, there was the Kalam, which is a school of Islamic philosophical theology.
Okay.
They tried to logically demonstrate creation, ex nihilo, out of nothing, and then from there, infer a creator.
Okay, so they started with the idea of creation and worked back to God.
Yeah, but Maimonides wasn't convinced by that approach.
Why not?
He believed that definitively proving or disproving creation through pure logic just wasn't possible.
It's ultimately beyond the reach of reason.
Exactly. But he did affirm his belief in creation.
So he personally believed it.
Yeah, he saw the evidence leaning in that direction, even if it wasn't conclusive.
So what were the other viewpoints he considered?
Well, there was Moses, obviously, who described creation ex nihilo in the Bible.
Right.
And then there was Plato, who believed in creation de novo, meaning from pre-existing matter.
So God shapes and forms that matter but doesn't create it from nothing.
Exactly. And then there was Aristotle, who argued for an eternal universe.
So no beginning, no creation.
Was not that simple. Aristotle believed that the universe was dependent on God as a prime mover.
But not a creator in the traditional sense.
Right, there was no specific moment of creation.
So what was Maimonides' own position?
He openly favored the Mosaic account.
The biblical one.
Right, and he saw Plato's view as a reasonable alternative.
But there's been a lot of debate about whether he secretly leaned towards Aristotle.
Oh yeah, that's a big scholarly debate.
Some people think his philosophical arguments point in that direction.
It's tricky because Aristotle's idea of an eternal universe poses some real challenges to traditional theology.
Like the idea of God's free will.
Exactly. If the universe is eternal and necessary, then God doesn't really choose to create it.
It just emanates from God's being.
Right, so how can a God without free will issue commandments?
That's a tough question.
Maimonides addressed some of the common philosophical objections to creation.
Like the argument that something can't come from nothing.
Yeah, he countered that by saying that the origin of the universe might be fundamentally different from the processes of change we see within it.
Like the rules might be different at that level of reality.
And he also tackled the idea that a perfect God wouldn't do something new, like create.
Because God is already complete and perfect.
Right, but Maimonides argued that God's will to create could have been part of the eternal divine plan.
So it's not really new in that sense.
It's all part of God's timeless intention.
Okay, so he was trying to show that creation was at least philosophically plausible.
Yeah, he was engaging with those arguments seriously.
But his most compelling critiques were aimed at Aristotelian cosmology.
The medieval interpretation of Aristotle.
Right, so what did he say about that?
Well, the Aristotelians believed in this elaborate system of celestial spheres.
Like nested shells around the Earth.
Right, and each sphere had an intelligence associated with it, and they all emanated from this single, simple first cause.
Which is God.
Yeah, but Maimonides questioned how all that complexity could arise from something utterly simple.
Like, how do you get all that intricate order from pure simplicity?
It's a classic problem, and he also pointed to what he saw as contingent features of the heavens.
Contingent, meaning they could have been different.
Yeah, like the speeds of the celestial spheres, the distribution of the stars, their luminosity.
Why would those things be so varied if everything was determined by necessity?
Exactly. To him, it suggested that there might have been a free, creative act involved.
So he wasn't definitively refuting Aristotle, but he was pointing to the limits of our understanding.
Right. He acknowledged that future scientific discoveries might explain things differently.
But given the vastness and complexity of the cosmos, he thought it unlikely that we'd ever prove a purely necessary origin.
He also had those pragmatic and theological reasons for favoring creation.
Right, like the problem of God's free will.
Yeah, and the fact that creation fits better with the biblical account.
But he never fully resolved that tension between divine simplicity and a divine will that could choose to create.
It's a deep philosophical puzzle,
So Maimonides was walking this tightrope between faith and reason.
trying to find a way to hold both together.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about his practical philosophy.
How we should live our lives.
Exactly. How do all these grand ideas about God and creation translate into ethical action?
Well, for Maimonides, the ultimate goal of human life was intellectual perfection.
To know as much as humanly possible.
Yeah, to reach the highest level of understanding.
And ethical behavior was a means to that end.
It was essential for creating the conditions for intellectual flourishing.
So it wasn't just about being good for goodness sake.
No, it was about clearing the path for intellectual growth.
Interesting. So how did he see that playing out in society?
Well, he believed that the state had a responsibility to educate its citizens in theology.
To promote understanding of God.
Exactly, to create a society that values knowledge.
And on a personal level, what did ethical behavior look like?
It involved controlling your passions.
Those unruly emotions.
Yeah, he saw them as obstacles to clear thinking.
You need a calm and focused mind to engage in philosophy and science.
Absolutely. He also drew heavily on Plato and Aristotle.
Those Greek giants.
Yeah, he was really influenced by their ideas about virtue.
What was his take on virtue?
Well, like them, he believed that virtue was a mean between extremes.
The golden mean.
Yeah, you have to find that balance point between excess and deficiency.
So courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness.
Exactly. You don't want to be too fearful or too rash.
He's all about finding that sweet spot.
And he recognized that this mean could vary depending on the individual.
Like what's moderate for one person might be extreme for another.
And he emphasized that virtue is developed through practice and habit.
It's not something you're just born with.
You have to cultivate it over time.
He also connected this to the idea of imitatio Dei.
Imitating God.
Right, because God's creation is perfectly balanced.
It exhibits no excess or deficiency.
So we should strive to emulate that divine harmony in our own lives.
And in the way we govern society.
So Jewish law, according to Maimonides, was all about promoting this moderation.
Not a life of extreme asceticism, but a balanced approach.
But there's a tension here, isn't there?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Because Maimonides believed that God doesn't have emotions.
Right. God is pure intellect.
So how can we, as emotional beings, strive to imitate God?
That's a great question, and Maimonides addressed it by introducing the concept of the Hasid.
The Hasid, what's that?
It's like a super pious person, someone who goes above and beyond the ordinary ethical standards.
Like a spiritual overachiever?
Yeah, he used Moses as an example.
Moses the prophet.
Right, he was known for his extreme meekness.
Which is a virtue, but it's also kind of beyond the normal mean.
Yeah, so Maimonides was saying that there are these higher levels of spiritual attainment.
Where you might transcend the ordinary ethical norms.
He also had a different view on anger than Aristotle.
How so?
Well, Aristotle believed that there was a place for righteous anger.
Like when you see injustice.
Yeah, but Maimonides thought that anger was always harmful.
Even when it seems justified.
He believed it clouded your judgment and led to bad decisions.
So he emphasized cultivating qualities like humility, awe, and shame in the presence of God.
Those were the true marks of spiritual maturity.
And he believed that we should strive to act with dispassionate reason, even in difficult situations.
Like a true Stoic.
So moral perfection was important, But it was ultimately a stepping stone
The goal was intellectual perfection,
to truly know and love God.
and that required a mind that was free from the distractions of passion.
So philosophy itself was a kind of therapy.
It helped you detach from worldly pursuits,
And focus on the eternal.
the things that truly matter.
Okay, one last thing before we wrap up. Esotericism.
Ah, the hidden meanings.
Did Maimonides intend for there to be a deeper layer to his writings?
That's a question that scholars are still debating.
It's a tricky one.
Maimonides knew that his ideas were controversial.
Especially his emphasis on reason and his reinterpretation of scripture.
He was challenging traditional ways of thinking.
And he talked about the Jewish tradition of not discussing esoteric matters in public.
It's like there were certain things you didn't talk about openly.
He even suggested that the Bible and the rabbinic commentaries had hidden meanings.
Not everything was meant to be taken literally.
And he even said that authors might intentionally present contradictory statements.
To conceal the truth from the uninitiated.
So he was aware of the idea of esoteric writing.
But did he actually use it himself in the Guide of the Perplexed?
That's the million-dollar question.
Some scholars, like Leo Strauss, argued that Maimonides' entire project was esoteric.
Like he was hiding his true beliefs between the lines.
They said that the more evidence he presented for a particular view, the less likely it was that he actually held it.
That's a pretty radical interpretation.
It is, and not everyone agrees with it.
But there's definitely a sense that Maimonides wasn't always laying all his cards on the table.
He was dealing with complex and sensitive issues.
So there's room for multiple interpretations.
That's part of what makes him so fascinating.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Maimonides, what are the key takeaways?
Well, he was a true intellectual giant, someone who tried to bridge the gap between faith and reason.
He gave us this radical concept of a God who's beyond all description.
And he showed us that religious texts can be interpreted in a way that's both intellectually rigorous and spiritually meaningful.
He grappled with fundamental questions about creation and the purpose of human life.
And he left behind a body of work that continues to challenge and inspire us centuries later.
So for anyone looking for a crash course in deep thinking,
Maimonides is a great place to start.
he offers a framework for engaging with the big questions.
And he reminds us of the limits of human knowledge,
That there's always more to learn.
and that sometimes the most profound truths are found in silence.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it enlightening.
If you're interested in learning more about Maimonides, we encourage you to check out his writings.
There's a whole world of thought waiting to be explored.
Happy diving!
Until next time.